Welcome, everyone. Feel free to continue introducing yourself and saying hello in the chat on this rather beautiful winter Thursday evening. I don't know if anyone had a chance to go outside today, but it was lovely compared to last week's weather. My name is Alexis Grant. I'm one of the co-instructors for the course. And I just wanted to give a little overview for folks who maybe are not registered for the course or haven't been to a session before. This is the Epidemics of Injustice course, which is free and open to the public from the UIC School of Public Health. And so we have a session about every Thursday, this time, same time, same place, except for our spring break. And our theme for this semester is resistance, rebellion, and revolution through public health. So we have a great variety of speakers coming from a little bit all over, but we have most of them from Chicago talking about their work and how that relates to advocacy and public health. So last week we heard from Dr. Soderberg on the housing crisis from Queen's University in Canada, and she talked a little bit about how we use this term housing crisis a lot, but it doesn't really reflect the fact that the housing crisis is really something that's been going on since the beginning of industrialization. So when we talk about the housing crisis, it implies some level of urgency and something new about it, when in fact it is derived from a lot of problems that are historical. So we heard a lot about that last week, and she talked about the need to think about housing as a home rather than housing as real estate. So we are building on a lot of those ideas this week as we hear from Dixon Romeo and Jonathan Wilson, who are community organizers, as well as Dr. Tyler Zimmer from the University of Chicago. So we're going to hear from these folks to get more of a closer look at what's happening in Chicago, as well as hearing about what does it look like to kind of respond with our understanding of all of the housing problems. What does that look like in terms of action, advocacy, and resistance, going along with all the themes of the course? So before we get started, I just want to put up our land acknowledgement. We are not on our land, we're on stolen land. I am sitting in Chicago, and I'm sure a lot of other folks on this call are. So I just wanted to acknowledge, we just wanted to acknowledge the native populations who used to call this land their home and still do call it their home. And if you do enjoy the session, the Collaboratory for Health Justice has a fund for this course so that we can keep it going. And then hopefully being able to offer other accessibility resources such as translation and closed captioning. So if you enjoy this course, please do consider giving to the Collaboratory Fund. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce our wonderful speakers for this week. We have Dr. Tyler Zimmer, who teaches philosophy at the University of Chicago. His research interests include the politics of gentrification, the philosophy of race and egalitarianism, and he is also part of the editorial collective of Rampant, a Chicago-based magazine that focuses on activism, movement organizing, and social justice. We also have with us Jonathan Wilson, who is a community organizer, circle keeper, educator, and revolutionary communist in the Chicagoland area. Born on Chicago's South Side, Avalon Park neighborhood, but raised in Gary, Indiana, as a result of housing displacement in Chicago during the early 2000s, Jonathan has a wide range of organizing in multiple communities and contexts. Jonathan's main organizing focuses are education and housing issues, along with addressing intercommunal violence. And we also have Dixon Romeo with us, who is a lifelong Chicago resident and a community organizer. Currently, he serves as the campaigns director for United Working Families, an independent community organizing group that recruits, trains, runs, and wins with Black and Brown candidates who come from the rank and file of movements for racial, social, and economic justice. He's also the political director for State Representative Lakeisha Collins and a member of Not Me, But We. So with that, I will first turn it over to our organizers, Jonathan and Dixon. So thank you very much. We give you a warm welcome.
Yeah. I was gonna say, we hear all the applauses out there. We hear it, right? The virtual applauses.
Yeah, well, I'll kick us off. John, do you mind if I kick us off and then?
Do your thing, brother.
Yeah. So I think having no idea of the context and the understanding that folks have in the audience about what's going around, like on the ground with housing. Like, I mean, I know I do see folks from some really good organizations like Safer Foundation. I'm seeing, I think I saw a Resurrection Project on here. I saw Pillars Community Health. So I guess I'll start by, and I just want folks to put it in the chat, like, what do they see as the number one issue around housing right now? I just want to do this for 30 seconds. I do this all the time, just because I want to see what folks say. Cost, affordability, affordability, cost. Okay, affordability. Landlords having the benefit out in court. So we got a lawyer in here. Systemic racism, false scarcity, eviction. Right. Environment. Good. Rising costs. Good. So upkeep of housing led. That's crucial. And so I asked that question because I think to something that Alexis mentioned, the previous speaker said, all of these things, as I see it, and I think someone like Tyler Zimmer, who I didn't realize, I saw his face, I've read some of his stuff, right? Like, is going to kind of get into it. But all of this stuff is like inherently part of the housing market, right? I always want to start off by framing it as like, these things are necessary for the housing market to work, and unfortunately are part of the reason why the things we're seeing now, a lot of folks wouldn't qualify as a crisis. That's the way it's supposed to work, right? When we talk about gentrification, what you're talking about is the ability to, systemically, right, economically and racially, use economic and racial bias or lack thereof to lower the value of something, right, in order for you to gain profit, right? So anyone who enters into a business, whether it's a landlord, whether it's someone who owns a hedge fund that then puts that money into a large landlord corporation, in order for these things to work, there has to be profit. In order for them to get that profit, there has to be some unevenness in the market. Someone has to have a disadvantage. Someone has to have a lack of information. Someone has to not have access in order for them to get that profit, right? I think that's really, really important anytime we're talking about housing, because it frames how we view the problem and I think how we view the solution. And so I know from a community organizer, I'm hitting you with like, econometrics or, 102 or whatever, but I think that's always a good place to start, right? I say that because I live in South Shore, which historically is a community that has been the number one, the eviction capital of Cook County for a couple of years. The last research I saw, and I'm sure it's still the same, we're also one of the zip codes that got the highest amount of folks when public housing was torn down and those vouchers were given out to some people. We got the highest amount of those people coming to the neighborhood. And then finally, what we also have is an area that I think did not benefit from proper zoning and proper planning, right, in order to make sure that this neighborhood could adjust to fluctuations in the housing market. You had a lot of folks, middle class, lose value in their homes or lose their homes altogether in 2008. And what that resulted in the conditions that we currently see, right? In addition to, we have like the Obama Center. We're one of the few communities in the country that has poor Black or working class Black people on lakefront property for a significant amount of the stretch, right? I just bring all that up because I think that's context into how I look at housing, into the experience that I've had as an organizer on the ground around housing. I'm gonna say two more things. I'm gonna let John go because we're both of us. But I say all that to say a lot of the things that folks have talked about, whether it's from eviction, systemic racism, affordability, cost, are all like inherent and built into that. And although there are a lot of solutions that we're going to talk about or that we take as organizers and researchers, and they're very good because we have to take them because they help people, they're necessary but ultimately inadequate, right? And so I just think that's really, really, really important framing. I'll pass it to John, and then I'll take it back when you're done to to get into a little bit more like what the organizing looks like.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, I think, Dixon had a lot of it on the head. I think in terms of diving in into like where we are right now, right? So Dixon was talking about how South Shore, was the eviction capital before COVID. And obviously we know like this pandemic has really exacerbated a lot of things, right? It's exacerbated employment, it's exacerbated education, right? I work in CPS, so we saw how it just exacerbated that situation, right? And then, obviously housing as well. And I think, just kind of touching the surface on what it is that, we've been doing, when this pandemic hit, I think a lot of us, particularly, folks in the Black community, we instantly knew, well, at least I know I did for a fact, I instantly knew we were going to get over-policed. I instantly knew it, right? And living in Washington Park, we saw the 20 cop cars riding through the neighborhood right at night, right, to keep us safe. But then we also knew that, there's going to be a lot of evictions that started happening. And I think, we, kind of felt moved, organized, rejuvenized, and I think focused on pulling folks together to fight that wave. So, so we got together, me, Dixon, and some other really dope organizers in South Shore or in the surrounding areas, got together and, started putting our heads together about how can we fight this, right? How can we make sure that, I know it's optimistic, but not one eviction happens, right, in this neighborhood. So, at least I know that was definitely my goal, right? Not one eviction. And so, we got together, got, and really just started building, right? Started, tenant organizing, now and Dixon is going to dive into more how that looks. But, now we're in buildings, talking to folks, organizing and developing, tenant associations. And then also, preparing for eviction defense as well, right? And so when you think about organizations like the Chicago Tenants movement, right? Which is, trying to kind of create this citywide response to evictions. I just really think, understanding like the seriousness of this time, even though these moratoriums, and it's so much to unpack, right? Even though these moratoriums that the Pritzker's continue to pass, we know that those are going to run out, right? We know that these moratoriums won't last forever. And so, I think the question is, what are we, prepared to do, right? And so I think part of that is putting, feet on the ground. Part of that is organizing and putting pressure on politicians. And part of that is, positioning and organizing ourselves so that not one eviction, happens in South Shore or anywhere else in the city. And I think a lot of folks are organizing for that effort. So I'll hand it back over to Dixon, though.
Yeah, thanks, John. Larger issues around with affordability. Thanks, Yvonne. That's a good piece. So I'll just talk about now, right? Like, so this is my organizer hat, but like Alexis said, I also work as a political director for a state rep. And so, the comments before were Dixon. Now this is me, in a different role. But I think it's important to look at, right? Like when we look at the state of Illinois, what are the tools and options that our state gives people or provides in order to address housing needs, right? And so I'll just kind of cover those super briefly. And then I do kind of want to, Alexis, if I'm not messing with the format too much, like let folks ask a couple questions here before Tyler. Okay. So, the state obviously can offer funds to address the affordability, right? So I think a lot of folks mentioned the rise in costs to affecting affordability. So maybe you give a developer or a landlord more money to be affordable. Maybe you offer up more vouchers for folks to be affordable, but ultimately that doesn't address the rise in costs, right? Subsequently, right, you could raise taxes and take more state or city or municipal funds and put towards the development of housing that could be public, could be publicly private owned or whatever, right? But the cost of that and the amount that's needed, unfortunately, doesn't meet up, right? And when we live in a city, state, and county that already operate at a deficit, with the exception of the county, you know, there's a tension there as well. I think the further solution that I sometimes hear from folks is around home ownership, right? If we can have people have more home ownership, this will help with the rental crisis. It's a supply side issue, right? Similar to the affordability development issue, there are not the barriers for folks getting homes are often exacerbated by rent, right? Like I'm sure everyone here has read Eviction by Matthew Desmond, or at least touched on the research points at some point, right? Like these evictions oftentimes cause or exacerbate poverty. They're not necessarily the result of it, right? And then I think also the last piece that I oftentimes hear that I just want to address and kind of have folks look at is that, you know, that certain things are maybe harder on landlords than they are on the renters, or maybe there's an equal burden there, right? And I would argue that, or I would assert that although that may be true in some cases, overall, what you have, in not only Illinois, but across the state, is you have a small group of folks who own a significant portion. It may not be a true all of or a true half, but they own a significant enough portion that they can affect the ebbs and flows of the market and affect the price, right? So with those four issues, there are, you know, different tools to address them, right? One of them is enacting state policy that would allow there to be some agency or some group or whatever that modifies and monitors the cost of rent, right? Oftentimes, and I know this is a college forum class, so I'll send it to y'all. There is good research by folks done by Matthew Desmond that shows that the highest profit a landlord can get or a developer can get is actually in a poor or gentrifying community versus an extremely rich one or an extremely blighted one, right? The profit does exist and folks make it. So the argument that modifying these things across the board would take away profit from smaller folks, when you look at the research, although there's not a ton, when you look at the research, doesn't necessarily hold up. Further, there are ways to have progressive taxes and progressive revenue that can help address the cost burden and the time burden that needs to happen, right? Further, in Illinois, as I'm sure all you all know, there's a statewide ban on rent control, right? So no municipality, no city, no county, no village can talk about anything dealing with the rent because of a law passed in 1997 by Alec and other folks. So I bring all that up to say that there are a lot of solutions to that help folks on the ground like John and I who do the actual organizing, right? Because what we have to help people with are these laws and these tools and these ordinances that exist, right? So the Chicago Landlord Rental Ordinance is a very useful tool for folks to fight back against, you know, improper evictions or landlords or in general. But if there is no accountability piece, if there's no teeth, if the city can't enforce it, if you get illegally locked out of your unit, right, there's a remedy for that. It's that you go to court. But, you know, if you're outside in your shorts and it's 20 degrees, you don't have your phone, or you don't have your wallet or whatever, I don't know how useful being able to go to court in 2 months is for me, especially in a pandemic, right? So I just want to, again, add more context that lends itself to folks asking questions. So if anyone's got any questions or like anything they're thinking about as we've kind of laid out a lot of general stuff, feel free to drop it in the chat. I'd love to hear from folks.
I actually had a question about how do you organize. So I remember even before the pandemic really hit, Block Club Chicago, like the local newspaper, did a story about these unofficial evictions, right? So especially in, I know, Logan Park, Pilsen, probably Little Village now, where you have populations of undocumented or mixed documented families, and then the landlords who, you know, they had these unofficial agreements or whatnot, because of gentrification, are like, if you don't go, I'm calling, you know, the authorities, I'm gonna call ICE or something like that. And using that as a method to get people out, to gentrify to help with the process of gentrification. And so I kind of wondered, how do you organize with undocumented folks whose evictions aren't even on the record because they're not considered official evictions because of their undocumented or mixed documented status?
John, I can take it if you want, John, but if you want, go ahead. Yeah, so I think there are groups, like obviously most of the organizing I do is on the South and West side, and predominantly Black areas, which, I think there's a misconception about like immigration and what their, folks' status. But I do know there are a lot of really good groups that have focused especially on how to do eviction defense and help people when they're dealing with ICE in particular. So there's like La Unite and Little Village and some other groups. And I think part of, and this is being recorded, and so I don't want to, I'll just say that I think there are tools and groups out there that are doing that work. And part of doing that organizing goes back to any type of organizing you're doing, which is like you have to do a lot of groundwork before some of these situations arise and you have relationships with folks, so that when you know their immigration status, you know that they may be at threat, you're able to activate and mobilize a network of folks who are able to assist in those situations. So the times I have seen, that's what I've seen, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I also think, I think that piece around like relationship building is very important. The groups who do, I think, like Dixon was saying, get into like a lot of the eviction defense stuff. They know the folks in the neighborhood, they know the folks in the block, right? So that way, it's not just them showing up, but it's a whole block or neighborhood or community. I think that's when we've seen, things like eviction defense and all of that be its most impactful. When the whole community has been involved in it.
Thank you so much. That really kind of gives me some kind of hope, because I know that NPR did a piece and they were like, at least 10,000 deaths from coronavirus are directly correlated with evictions. So these evictions are literally killing people.
And, even in Chicago, at least, my time growing up in the city, I've never really seen, I guess, we see this in so many ways, right? When we hear about it, right, we know it's happening that way, or just, based on what we read. But when I was growing up, I never really saw like people having to make homes out of bus stations and bus terminals, right? That are, outside, right? Open air things in Chicago. I've never seen it. So, I think that, the fact that we can also see these different things, right? We can see the red line, these train lines, right? Red line and blue line, because the city has, closed mental health facilities, and then also, exacerbated this eviction crisis and housing crisis that, people have to turn to the red line and the blue line, right, for housing. And so, I think it's, so I think what you're saying, how do we fight that is key.
We have a question in the chat. Are the tenant protections within the CRTLO documents currently considered enough? Are organizers pushing for more ordinances or protections in the law?
I think, I'm not actually as familiar with that particular document. I do think, so there's two different housing, I guess, movements kind of happening in the city right now. Or Dixon, definitely chime in if it lets you mute. But, I to my knowledge, I know that there's the struggle, around lifting the ban on rent control. And, I think there's also the struggle around, the moratorium, right, on evictions. To my knowledge, those are the two main forms of like legislation that are really being fought for and pushed. And then I know, and Dixon may know a little bit more about this in terms of the situation, on the South Side and Woodline in terms of the Obama Center. I know that, folks fought for that to not displace folks. But, I think it's about, I think these ordinances, I guess for me, right, I'm not the biggest like legally, to be honest, right? I'm more, I think these things, laws and things aren't enforced, right? To me, history shows they're not enforced unless there's a mass of people ready to push for them to. So I think for me, it's about how do we get that, get that mass of people, right, ready to push for, you know, these different types of ordinances and legislations that that we need, right, to be safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, can I jump in to answer? I think it was Sarah. I can't see the chat from before, but Sarah's question. So yeah, I mean, I think to John's point, I think a lot of,
if you'd like.
Sure, go ahead.
Yes. Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry. About the CRLTO documents, are the tenant protections within it currently considered enough? Are organizers pushing for more ordinances / protections in the law?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So the first one, no, and the second one, I think, is a combination of John's question, and then I'll bring up something else. Right. So currently, as someone who's had to like advise tenants on using that and work with lawyers to use that in court and to use that to enforce it, no. Right. I say that because there is no office of the, if you go to criminal court as a public defender, right? There's no office of the tenant advocate. Like cities like Philadelphia has something similar, DC has something like that. Those things don't exist here in Chicago. And so what you have is a lot of folks who don't know the ordinance. Even if they do, it's hard to enforce it because there is no go-to person to call. If you go look on the city's website right now for where to go to get, right, there's LCBH that does a lot of good job and work around that. But again, right, like I think just like any other nonprofit organization, they have capacity issues, which I think a lot of you all, if I'm remembering correctly, all the folks on this call understand and know, right? And so I think the second piece is that I think organizers, although getting the ordinance together is a good deal, they're focused on because of the capacity piece, folks have to focus on the bigger fish, right? And so I think the big fish is like issues around rent control. I think like Chicago Coalition of Homeless is pushing for money to address homelessness. I think that, LCBH has been, and Shriver Center have been really helpful on the state side, pushing for things around like extending moratoriums, just cause eviction, et cetera, et cetera. So folks are definitely pushing and fighting for more at the state and city level because we already know and see that the current ordinance is nowhere near enough.
Thank you for that. If we don't have any more questions, do you all, John and Dixon, would you like to share information about how folks can learn more about what you're doing and your organizing efforts?
Yeah, sure thing. So, so we recently, started a group called Not Me, We, focused on, in South Shore and in the surrounding adjacent areas. So yeah, I think, Dixon just put his information in the chat. I'll put mine as well. I think it's a new organization. So, we're still, formulating a lot of things. But there are a lot of other, organizations that have been doing this as well. Unite, like Dixon was mentioning, Unite, I want to say is based in Little Village. Solidaridad is also another organization focused in Little Village that's doing a lot of work around housing. And there's, other different organizations like STOP, like COCO, which have been doing stuff in Bronzeville, in the Woodline, right? Which, you want to talk about, gentrification, right? Bronzeville and Woodline are the epicenter of it. I didn't even know it was called Bronzeville until I got older. It was always a low end to me, right, growing up. And so, I think those are some organizations that are doing some really good work around different housing, issues as well.
Thank you. And someone was asking in the chat, can we put all these things on a list and send it out? Yes, certainly we can. If you're here, you register for the session, so we have your email, so we can definitely send out a document with links to all these resources. So thank you all for contributing in the chat. We'll be sure to include that. With that, I will kind of pass the mic over to Dr. Zimmer. And John and Dixon, as you're here, feel free to chime in, and we will have some more time after Dr. Zimmer to keep talking and having this discussion. So if you have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat.
Hi, I'm Tyler Zimmer. I teach philosophy at Chicago, and I think one of the reasons I was asked to speak was that I wrote an article for a magazine that I helped co-found called Rampant, and in the article I look at housing organizing in the 1930s. So I'll say a little something about that, and I'll say maybe just a little bit about some of my my academic work on gentrification. But I want to say I'm not as involved in the organizing around housing justice in Chicago as I'd like to be. And the stuff that Dixon and John are talking about sounds terrific. And I think we really do need to lift the ban in Illinois so that we can have some kind of democratic control over the cost of rental housing and so on. So let me just quickly give you a little taste of some of the things that I was looking at in the article. So I should say, first of all, I'm not a historian, and most of the interesting things that I discovered about the housing justice organizing going on in the 1930s was I discovered in a book by the historian Randy Storch called Red Chicago. And in turn, it seems like she did a lot of research just talking to folks in Chicago who were around then. And, from the conversations that she had, she learned a lot. So I'm just grateful to have some, access to some of that. I'm sure that, some of the experience of the 30s, I'm sure there are folks, there must still be, I don't know the math, right? Like, there must be folks that are alive from that time still, although they're quite old, who have stories that, things to add to this that I'm not aware of. But so let me just it's a kind of, on the face of it, a kind of like crazy story. Like, it sounds like, kind of improbable, but in the 1930s, in the midst of the Great Depression, the Communist Party in Chicago was actually several thousand members strong, and in a city as relentlessly segregated and relentlessly racist as Chicago, that organization managed to bring together activists, Black activists, recent white immigrant activists, all kinds of different. It was a multiracial group in a city that was relentlessly racist, in which the city government, did a lot to try to discourage and punish any kind of interracial solidarity or any activism, for that matter, on the part of Black people advocating for their interests. So one of the things that this Communist Party did that was quite interesting, and I there's got to be some cognitive dissonance for at least some of us. Like, when we hear Communist Party, communists are bad. We're certainly not encouraged in the U.S. to think of the Communist Party as a potentially good thing. But if we just sort of can imagine, in the 1930s, that not all the baggage around socialism and communism would have been, would have weighed as heavily on people as it does now. And, I want to say, I think, probably there were plenty of problems with the Communist Party internationally and in sort of what it did in Chicago. But in spite of all those problems, it did really, really interesting, inspiring activist work. So one of the things that it did is it built a broad range of organizations that were fighting evictions in Chicago in the 1930s. And as you can imagine, right, it's a cataclysmic, terrible economic depression. It hurts all workers in the city, but it hits Black workers much harder for all kinds of reasons that you can imagine. Black workers tended to be, because of racist restrictions in the labor market, concentrated in some of the most lower paid, some of the lower paid jobs, some of the jobs that were less secure. So when the Depression hit and they started laying people off, Black workers were hit the hardest. When people lose their jobs and they lose their incomes, of course, evictions are likely to follow. So one of the things the party did was it brought people together, and not everybody who was involved in this activism was a party member, but it brought people together, and they got masses of people together. So some of them would just kind of meet. A lot of organizing went on in Washington Park on the South Side. So the book describes, just thousands of people in Washington Park just debating politics, organizing, meeting one another, and so on. Presumably this didn't happen in February in the winter. I don't know. I kind of imagine it's like green and like in the summer or something. But, one of the things they would do is they would just get people together and they would say, guess what? There's an eviction happening at this intersection. And like hundreds of people, I'm not exaggerating. I'll give you one example in a moment. Hundreds of people would march over there and stop the eviction. They would take people's furniture and put it back in their home. And as you can imagine, this frustrated the authorities. So the city government got really upset and they told the CPD that they needed to clamp down on this and stop it. So I'll just give you one quick story about how this kind of how the authorities kind of clamped down on the thing, and then maybe I'll say I don't know, maybe I'll stop and see if there are questions. I don't want to go on forever. So this is a really, really interesting anecdote, but so I've kind of given you some of the context. Anti-eviction organizing is like wildly successful. Lots of people are supporting it and participating in it, and it's starting to really displease and frighten the authorities in City Hall. And let's see, this would have been I don't have a date, but it's mid 1930s. Abe Gray, who was his comrades in the party, he was a member of the Communist Party, remembered him as one of the best organizers in the party. He led a march of people. It says the estimates are between 800 and 1,000 people from Washington Park down 51st Street to Dearborn to the residence of Diana Gross, who's a 71-year-old African-American woman who was being evicted by her landlord. So, I mean, just imagine the scene. Like, there are people that are just in Washington Park talking politics, talking organizing, and all the rest. And, Abe Gray is an organizer with the party. He gets word that like this eviction's happening. And this isn't like the first time that they've done this. Lots of the folks that participated in this action had done similar actions before. But you have 800 people marching down the street, to stop the eviction of a 70-year-old woman. The CPD showed up and they said, look, if you do this again, we're going to punish you. I think that the exact words that they were alleged to have said were something like, if you go out on any more evictions today, you're going to get drilled. And it ended up being the case that that there was police repression of the next action that they took, and Abe Gray wound up he wound up being killed by the police. And there was a huge march on the South Side. This included Black activists and white activists. It's sort of hard to imagine, the scale of this thing, but there was a huge march to basically say like we condemn police violence against the anti-eviction movement, and we're gonna knock down some of these barriers that City Hall and people that have an interest in evicting people and profiting from housing. We're gonna knock down the barriers that they have constructed and used to kind of keep people divided and powerless. And so that's just like one kind of anecdote, but there are lots like these. And I think it's really interesting to think about this history because it happened right here in Chicago. And it attracted a lot of support, and obviously there's stuff happening right now that's in its legacy. That's moving the needle as we speak. I just found this history really inspiring, and I found it almost difficult to believe at first that it got so much traction. And if it could happen then, it can happen now. And I just want to think more about what we can do to build the movement to stop evictions and to lift the ban on rent control. I sometimes talk to students about rent control, and it's like they kind of squint their eyes at me like, what do you mean rent control? I'm like, like a law that says that the landlord can't raise the rent by more than a certain percentage per year, or just can't raise it. And they look at me and they're like, what are you talking about? You can't do that. And I'm like, I mean, you can do it. We have it in other places in the US, other countries do it and so forth. And it's just like, it seems like obviously right to a lot of people. Obviously, if you have a ton of rental properties and you want to maximize rental income and you're a landlord, you don't want to have rent control. I mean, that makes sense to me, but that's a very small number of people. And if we had a vote on the thing, I would think that, most people would support, some kind of rent stabilization or some kind of measure to stop rents from just soaring and pricing people out. I'll just go ahead and I've talked for quite a while. I'll just go ahead and stop there. But I thought the history was very useful, and I think that it raises interesting questions for us now in terms of thinking about what, how to move forward.
Thank you. So we have a question in the chat here. Zoe says, I'm curious how rent control is balanced against financial needs of smaller scale landlords. And I assume these folks are in the minority.
Yeah, that means a good question. Most successful rent control ordinances have to make, they have to have language in them that do make exceptions for small scale landlords. Like imagine somebody who owns a 2-flat and they're paying the mortgage, and then they have one tenant on the second floor, and they're struggling to get by or something. I mean, you wouldn't want the law to there are probably ways, subsidies and so on that could be dispensed to help that person maybe defray their costs. But I think the bigger picture is that there are a lot of just very large scale landlords that I don't even know if it's fair to call them landlords. They're people who have invested money in rental properties, and they're just thinking about numbers, return on an investment. I mean, they don't, as far as they're concerned, their money might as well be invested in any number of other different things. It's rather abstract as far as they're concerned. And I think for these very large scale investors, I at least find it very difficult to think that, if push comes to shove, we should prioritize their ability to make maximum profit over the ability of people to, stay in their communities. Because I think affordability is part of it, but it's also the right to stay in your own community, not to be pushed out of where you live. So it would be suppose somebody said, we're going to let rents appreciate. We're just going to give you a voucher so that, or we're going to give you money so you can, purchase housing elsewhere. I mean, that's better than nothing, but it's still wrong in my view to just push people out of their communities because somebody decided that, it's profitable to do so. Yeah.
So I can ask the second question. I also think it's interesting because in New York, where I'm from, we have rent control for a lot of things, and there's a lot of things that are rent is based on income and other kind of methods. And some may not know this, but you can actually, if you're on Section 8, there's ways to use that to help pay for a house. My friend is actually the one who told me about that. When she moved to California, they told her, because a lot of houses are modular, you can help use that for that. But the question, there's another question that says, how has this kind of physical eviction prevention changed since the 1930s? Are events like that still successful? Do they still happen?
I mean, I would think that's a question that maybe John and Dixon would be better placed to answer since they're doing more organizing on the ground. I think it is striking. One thing I'll just say really quick, I think it's striking that police violence was a big problem in the 1930s when it came to trying to, stop activists from challenging, some of these, challenging things like eviction. And I would think that's still a concern today. But I'd be curious to hear what John and Dixon think about the continuities between the past and the present.
Yeah, I'll jump in really, really quickly here. I'm letting Professor Zimmer do his thing. He got the degrees and stuff. I only got one from the Grinnell College, nothing crazy. But I think, so one of the things that the Lift Demand Coalition has done that I think is really, really key is that we've talked to all, can folks hear me? Okay,
yes.
So we've talked to folks in New York. We've talked to folks in San Francisco. We've talked to folks that have tried or tested or studied rent control. And I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question right. The question is, does the rent control, because I'm seeing some stuff in the chat that I just want to push forward with folks on when it comes to the idea of rent control. We haven't seen rent control, in my opinion, implemented in a proper way that has been put to actually effectively monitor and make rents grow at a rate that's manageable for not only business owners, but for residents. And so I think, and I'm going to push back again, right, against some of the comments in the chat, it's not, when it comes to housing, and I think personally when it comes to any policy that deals with Black people, right, because that's who this predominantly affects, Black and Latinx folks. I mean, I think it affects everyone, but in particular, right, it's not either or, right? We're in a scarcity mindset that we don't need to be in. It can be both, right? Signing rent control into law does not cost the state a single dollar, right? So that doesn't mean that if there's rent control, we don't still develop affordable housing. Doesn't mean we don't still have grant programs. Doesn't mean we still don't have vouchers. What it means is that a landlord cannot, because legal right now it is 100% legal. My landlord can come up to my apartment where I am right now and quadruple my rent, and there is nothing that can stop that. Now, ordinarily, you would think, well, the market would address that. But I think what we miss in that analysis are two very key things. If the landlord owns every or a significant amount of buildings in the neighborhood, and they quadruple the rent, then that then becomes the market rate. Because if I'm a small landlord and I own something next to that, and there are folks in the country, maybe not in the neighborhood or in the city, but there are folks in the country who are coming from other places who can afford that, then that then becomes the market price. I think the second thing we're thinking about is we talk about the market and how we use that to deviate around housing. If I go in a grocery store and Snapple decides to raise the price of, a juice to $14, I'm gonna buy, I'm gonna buy a Fanta or a Mountain Dew, right? But when it comes to housing, you have to have somewhere to live, right? Like, you need somewhere to stay. It's essential to doing everything that you need to do every day. And so this idea that the market is going to properly deviate and put you where you need to be around that just isn't, true or isn't helpful. So I think the amount of work that's gone on in the Lift the Ban bill and the versions of the bill that exist here in Illinois, the organizers behind that campaign have talked to more folks than these folks in other places have. And when we talk to folks and these lawyers in like New York and other places, what they're telling us is that we're covering the right steps to address it, and these things have to have teeth in order to be effective. And you got to get around those major loopholes. So I just wanted to add that context.
Too, if I can talk to some of those points too, I think to the question about the physical evictions, I think nationally, right, they're still happening, right? So I think in terms of Chicago, the Chicago anti-eviction movement hasn't gotten to that point yet, but I think, there's articles about it, and I'll try to find them too while we're here, but there's articles about how in LA, right, the LA Tenants Union is really dope, and I think they do like these massive eviction defense campaigns where, and I even think in LA they took over a building and just said, we're just gonna live here now on, right? So I do think nationally, like, these things are still happening. I think in Chicago it's a little bit more spontaneous and smaller scale, right? We don't have one organization like the Communist Party was, right? They had thousands of members, strong. There's a lot of different organizations now. But yeah, so, that effort isn't there, but I do think that it's, getting there. There are a lot of like smaller scale physical, things done to prevent evictions, but nothing like en masse at what they're doing, right? Not 100 people pulling up and moving stuff in, but, hopefully, things will get to that point. Also, I guess, just want to kind of talk about, like, in history class, right, we learn about, the Great Migration, right, when Black folks moved up north from the South. And, I think we have to call this what it is, right? Right now we're experiencing a great displacement, right, in terms of Black communities, right? There's a systematic effort to, I think, move Black people out of this city, turn it into a global city, right? Chicago, there's documents, right? Hundreds of pages long talking about how Chicago is trying to turn itself into a global city. And that does not include Black folks, right? So yeah, I think when we're talking about, fighting against, rising rents, like, we're talking about fighting against displacement, right? When we're talking about fighting against schools closing, right? Dixon is a part of a campaign to stop schools from closing in North Lawndale. Like that's fighting against this displacement that we're talking about. Right. We won round one. So yeah, I think, we have to call those things what it is, right? Like, I remember growing up in Gary. So I'm born in Chicago, grew up in Gary. Most of the folks in Gary, when I was there, we were Chicago refugees, right? Like, most of us were folks who, when they tore down the projects, because they wanted to build this beautiful area for the Olympics that they didn't get. You know, a lot of us were products of that, right, being shipped out to these other areas. So yeah, I think, you know, thinking about it in that context of like, we're up against a machine that has a very systematic plan to turn this city into something that does not include Black folks, right? At least to live in, right? They still need folks to work certain jobs, but to live in, you know, that plan doesn't include the Black folks who are here.
We have some more questions I did want to get to, but I also wanted to point out there are ads like Chicago it's the way it's framed. You're right. They're saying we need builders, right? We need builders for this new Chicago we're envisioning. So learn a trade or learn a skill, right? And I don't know who has seen those ads, but I'm kind of sick of seeing those ads because generally those are targeted toward, and I think I worked at a technical college, so I think that trades and skills are extremely valuable. I'm not trying to say one type of skill or trade is more valuable than getting a different type of education, but those ads are really targeted toward help build Chicago, but they're not targeted toward live in the city that we're building, right? They're definitely targeted in that particular way. I'm trying to see what question wasn't answered. Oh, do you think rent control has led to some astronomical rents in New York City?
I think there are a lot of, I'll say something about, you know, rent control in New York City is kind of a mess. Like, it's good that it exists, because if it didn't exist, you know, rents would be much higher than they are. Like whatever they are now, they would be even higher if there weren't at least some caps, some forms of rent control in New York City. The problem is that the rent control in New York City has been eroded over decades. The people that run city government in New York don't really believe in it anymore. So instead of strengthening it and making sure that it's robust, it's been slowly just kind of whittled away. And you have situations where landlords sometimes have perverse incentives to, like, you know, turn off heat and water so that a tenant with rent control leaves, and they can replace it with somebody who, you know, is going to pay market rent, and they can make more money. So I just want to say there are plenty of places in the world, so in Canada and Western Europe, where they have extensive rent control, and it's way more comprehensive, and it doesn't result in all the awful consequences that many critics in the US say that it's going to result in. I mean, I've heard economists say to me, like, you know, I don't think this is every economist, by the way, but I've definitely had this objection posed to me that, like, if you have rent control, you know, there are going to be buildings collapsing, and it's, you know, there's going to be a housing shortage, and all these terrible consequences are going to occur. And I think the first thing to say is, well, that's just, I mean, not the case in, you know, countless Western European cities where there's really extensive laws that prevent landlords from just raising the rent however much they want from year to year. So for me, the root issue is, like, who should have the authority, the power to decide who can live where? If you say the market, I think that's kind of an abstraction, because really what we're talking about when we say the market is landlords and developers should have the last say. And I think people ought to have more say, more democratic control over their communities, even if they're renting. So I don't think that we should just let people who are just thinking about return on investment, you know, have all the say. I think rent control, you know, it isn't perfect. Frankly, I think a better way to think about things would be to decommodify housing, not to think of it as just a commodity with the market price, but to, you know, have social housing and so on. That has a bad rap in the US, but take Vienna, a very wealthy country in Western Europe and Austria. I think something like 50% of the housing in Vienna is public housing, and it's well funded and it's very nice. And, you know, it's definitely possible. But yeah, building a movement for it is a different matter. Obviously, it's going to be difficult to win, but it's possible.
Yeah, we actually did talk about Vienna specifically last week too, because although it was great, one of the issues was you had to be, like, from that country, and, you know, with issues with immigrants and migration, and they've recently changed the rules, obviously, right? But we did talk about that and the vices and virtues of that kind of housing. So the next question is, should rent control replace housing programs that are based in grants, since many housing programs are limited to certain timeframes? Do you think that would assist addressing the housing epidemic?
I think what I think Dixon said earlier that rent control doesn't cost the state anything. All it does is say that it restricts the ability of landlords to raise rents however quickly and however high they like. So presumably there could still be other kinds of programs that help people defray housing costs or whatever it might be. I mean, even if you just froze rents where they are right now with a rent cap, it's still the case that rents are high for a lot of people, higher than they can afford. There might still need to be subsidies to help them pay for things. As far as shortages are concerned, I think I'm not sure that that's a problem in Chicago. I mean, one of the for me perverse things about letting the market handle all these sorts of questions is that you get huge swaths, surpluses of empty housing, which speculators just sit on because it makes good sense for them from the perspective of profit to sit on it and wait for somebody with a lot of money to come along and take it, then to lower the price and allow somebody who needs it to use it. So I have a hard time. I'll just be honest with you. Every winter, being homeless in Chicago, I mean, I'm sure there are people that die every winter because they don't have a home. And every winter, there are way more empty, very nice, housing units than there are people who need them. So there's actually a surplus. So I think that for me, that's a kind of problem of misallocation, because I think we should prioritize human needs. But if you only had the perspective that, housing is a commodity, it's an investment, people want to make money off of it. Obviously, you don't want to let people, use it. You want to sit on it and wait until you can make your money and so forth.
So the student wants to clarify about the housing programs, referring to transitional housings where there's 2-year programs, not permanent supportive housing and Section 8 voucher housing. I did want to say, yes, that's true. And the solution that people are coming up with are these tiny homes. And I understand, but at the same time, it's frustrating because you're creating this solution to a problem that already has a solution. Right. Also, if you don't know, this one tiny homes, there was a tiny home movement. I don't know if it was San Francisco or somewhere else to help homeless people that wasn't sanctioned by the state. There's a new one that is, but the ones that weren't sanctioned by the state were destroyed by cops. They took the houses and then they broke them and threw them into ditches. And now we have same exact models too, that are being built by people and the governor toured them and all these other things. And it's so much cheaper to just put someone in a freaking place. But yeah, so that was the student that wanted to clarify that for you, what they meant. Seattle, yes. Seattle.
I can add to that, really quick. I think other examples of, that are, if anybody's ever been to Gary, Indiana, right? If anybody's ever been to Inglewood, West Inglewood, right? There's tons of buildings, right, that could be used to house people, right? And that this city, has made a deliberate decision to not do that, right? On the north side, when I was living up north, in Uptown, there's a school, I forgot what the name was, but they turned the school into a luxury loft, right? This was a school that housed mostly Black students, and they closed it, right? When Rahm closed the 50 schools down, and they turned it into a luxury loft, right? So talk about a commodity, right? Commoditizing, something, right? That these kids' education was not as equally as important as this building that they can make money off of. And then to add insult to injury, they kept all of the chalkboards and all of these other things, right? To make this luxury loft look like a school, right? That these kids just went to, right? They kept all these things to make it look, aesthetically appeasing. So this is, Stewart Homes. I think it's Stewart Loss or something. But yeah, so right, they don't need to build these tiny homes. There's tons of buildings right now, right? But Lightfield wants to turn them into cop academies. So.
Yeah, I just want to really quickly second something I think you said, John, that like the austerity, like all these cutbacks and look where the cutbacks are being implemented. If you look at the school closures, it was almost entirely all on the South and West side. And it's, mental health care clinics, other sorts of, budget cuts. It's connected to gentrification. It basically says, that we're going to drain resources out of these communities and try to eventually repopulate them with wealthy white people, because that's the way to if from an investment perspective, that's people's plan to make money and so on. So I think the two things are connected, unfortunately.
I just want to jump in again. I think what Professor Zimmer is talking about is how do we find, or how does the state create that inefficiency that then lets folks be able to profit, right? Because to the point of austerity, it's part of this philosophy that if I move all the poor people out, I don't have to spend their tax money on them. I can spend it on stuff I want, which is to incentivize businesses, which is to bring in other people who then will either avoid those taxes or pay them to us, and then they'll pay them to try and redo the process again to folks higher up, right? It's not about adequately using the resources that are there. Although we live in a capitalist society and there's never going to be true equity in that model, we can do a lot better in the model that we have, and we're not because of these policies that we have, right? So just want to take that, look how I come around. I just want to take that full 360 real quick.
We can get to the next question. 1 second, I have it in a document. What are the political barriers to lifting the ban on rent control, especially since it doesn't cost the state anything? Why is it so tough to make happen? Do big rental companies have that much power in state politics?
Yeah, I'd be curious to see what John and Dixon think about that. I mean, my sense is that it's not just people. So there's a lot of speculation on real estate in Chicago, and it's a really big deal. So for a lot of people that aren't strictly speaking what you would consider to be rental companies or landlords. So there's a lot of people invested in it. I think we should also consider that there's going to be, I mean, ALEC, the American Legislative Executive Council, which is this kind of corporate funded entity that writes model legislation from its perspective, that it gives them to land, so like to legislators to pass. They succeeded in passing this bill in I think 30 different states or something. Rent control is only legal in 4 states. So I think we have to consider the possibility that there will be probably outside money from other states pouring in, because it would be a bad precedent from their perspective to have a city as big as Chicago win rent control, especially in this climate. Because other people are going to start saying, well, why can't we have that too? That's a good idea. Nonetheless, I think it's possible. I think it's going to take a lot more education of the public. I think there are a lot of people who just don't even know that it's a possibility to win rent control. I've talked to so many people about it, and they're for it, but they didn't even realize it was possible. They're like, are you even allowed to do that? So I think raising people's expectations and educating more people about it, and doing organizing work is going to be necessary to beat it. But my sense is that it's going to be a fight. It's not going to be easily passed. But I'm sure John and Dixon probably have better sense of what the nuts and bolts of organizing around it are.
Yeah, I'll be super brief and not name names or anything. So I think what you have when it comes to rent control is, like Dr. Zimmer said, we're not treating, Professor Zimmer, Tyler, we're not treating housing as a human right, and we're looking at it like it's not a crisis. I think you have the real estate lobby is a very big and powerful lobby in Springfield. I'm saying that as someone who's had to personally work and try and battle them, and they're smart cookies and they understand the landscape. I think another thing that you have is that Chicago is not the whole state, and unfortunately, although this is a crisis statewide, the amount of organizing, the amount of groups, the teachers unions, the universities, the places that produce folks that are fighting towards this, don't exist in other parts of the state. So it's a tougher sell for some of those legislators. That being said, there are some legislators here who have communities that overwhelmingly need rent control, brazenly need rent control. There's no other option that they can use, and they resist it because of a lack of belief and because of their own inherent bias, and they may have some financial interest themselves, right? That ties into it. So that's part of the problem. If anyone is interested in Lift the Ban Coalition, I put my email in the chat before, but I'll do it again, and I can connect you to that coalition, and you can either become a part or learn more or be supportive. I think that'll be key.
And then I think also, I guess for me, it's like, centering, organizing, but I think, people actually like, fighting back, right? So Dr. Zimmer's article details, folks organizing and fighting back. So I think history shows us that, right? History shows us that women, Black folks, nobody got the right to vote. Nobody got the right to drink out of a water fountain. Nobody got a right to do any of these things by just wanting them to happen, right? Folks had to pull up their sleeves. Folks had to organize. In many instances, folks had to sacrifice, right? Their time, their energy, their brain power, and some folks, right, their bodies, right, to make sure that these things happen, right, to make sure that counters got desegregated, right? I mean, we just celebrated Karen Lewis, right, who really, changed the landscape of this city, breathe a breath of fresh air in terms of fight back, right? So, I think we definitely have to center that, because lifting the ban on rent control is not going to happen unless we fight for it, right? Housing being a right and not being a commodity is not going to happen unless we fight for it, right? People not getting evicted out of them homes is going to keep happening unless we fight against it, right? Organizing ourselves, getting involved, tapping into organizations that are doing that work, right? So yeah, for me, it's about centering that they're going to do what they're going to do, right? Lori's going to do what she's going to do. These real estate folks, they're going to do what they're going to do. But what are we going to do, right, to counteract what they're doing, right? So I think that's what we have to center, because they want to make money, right? They've made it abundantly clear every opportunity they get. So I think we have to show them that what we want, the type of world that we want to have.
Yes. And I think that leads really well into our next question. So I was like, how can mutual aid groups assist and support issues surrounding housing? I know when we had the Love Fridge guest, they did talk about how they do work that with mutual aid, as opposed to charity, it's more about collaboration rather than competition. So perhaps y'all can speak on that, and like places or other orgs y'all have collabed with.
I was gonna let Dixon take that. He's the mastermind. Or I can do it. Okay, he may be on his other call. Okay, yeah. So I think so part of like Not Me We, right? The organization we created in South Shore started out as mutual aid. It started out as us doing food distribution during the pandemic in the summertime, and then from there, that's when we were able to start having these other conversations with families who were impacted. So that mutual aid kind of led into us getting invited into different buildings throughout South Shore in terms of organizing. So I think that's how that kind of manifests itself. But yeah, I think mutual aid, is very crucial, because I think a lot of times that's how you meet, folks who are, I think mostly, at need, right? Or folks who may know that things. So yeah, I guess another thing with doing mutual aid, just to take a step back, is particularly like Black folks, when we talk to folks, like there's been situations where we've been talking to people and they're like, yeah, I haven't had a tub for 5 years, right? And so it's like people have gotten used to, right, this subhuman treatment, right, that the city, that elected officials give. So I think, being a part of mutual aid, I think opens up that door to start having those conversations with folks who typically wouldn't be heard, right? They would just continue living with not having a tub, right? But now, through us, giving food and things like that, and them also, right, mutual aid, right? So it's not just charity, and them bringing different resources to us, right? Now we got some things cooking here, right? So yeah, I think mutual aid is very crucial and important to any housing movement for sure.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think one of the most important things about it is it just shows people that they're not alone. You know, that the society tries to get everybody to blame themselves. You know, if you're poor, it's your fault. You deserve to be poor, and the only buddy that can help you is yourself. And I think one of the things that's really powerful about mutual aid is, you know, you find out like, you know, I'm not alone. You know, it's not me, it's us, it's we. You know, it's like solidarity. It's basically what people are discovering, and that's the way to change things. Whether it's mutual aid or organizing or whatever it might be, strikes. It's solidarity. It's people sticking together and saying, you know, an injury to one is an injury to all.
Oh, someone raised their hand, but we're in the, I'll go back to the chat. I'll get to it in a second. We get to the next question. I'm not muted, right?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure because it was stalling. So this was really interesting. So a student on our discussion board asked about how not to gentrify, right? And there are some complicated kind of things at hand. So for instance, their husband is Mexican and lives in a little village, right? You know, they're white, so they're not Mexican, and they've moved in. And there are, you know, plenty of people in other types of, you know, these kinds of relationships. And I think we could also talk about perhaps non-white gentrification, because I do think a lot of people think gentrification is a very black and white issue. And I think that it's not. I think it's very complicated. And as someone like, I live in the South Bronx, I'm from the South Bronx, right? And we're one of the last areas to not be gentrified, but the assumption that it's only this group of people or that group of people, I do think that it kind of, it tries to oversimplify the issue. So perhaps while you're answering the question about how kind of not to gentrify, especially in these cases, what would you, I guess, say to those things?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of quick things. I'm curious what other people think. I agree that, you know, well, in the US, given how, you know, how racist housing markets have been and all the rest, you know, it's difficult to find cases of gentrification that don't seem to involve racism in some way or other. But it is important to point out, like the sociologist Mary Patillo, she's at Northwestern. She has a book called Black on the Block, but it looks at gentrification in Kenwood, and it's wealthier Black folks pushing out poor and working class Black folks. So it's definitely possible to have that, you know, that kind, or wealthy white people pushing out poor white people and so forth. So definitely is a possible phenomenon. It is a thing that happens. As far as like the ethics of it, what should you do? That's complicated. I mean, I think being mindful of where gentrification is occurring and keeping that, you know, in view when you decide, you know, where to rent and where to live and so on is important. But I think the bigger picture is that this isn't a thing we can solve through individual decisions. Like if one person decides not to move to Pilsen because it's gentrifying, that's not going to stop Pilsen from gentrifying. It's either going to gentrify or it isn't, because there are people that are going to profit from it gentrifying and they're going to keep trying. And I think the bigger picture is we have to think about the landlords and the developers. Not necessarily the tenants, you know, that are the ones raising rents and so on. So I think there is an ethical component to it, but I guess maybe the most important thing is just ensuring that folks can stay in their homes so the landlord's not kicking them out and looking for some new tenant in the first place.
Yeah, you know, I think just echoing what you all are saying, yeah, I think Kenwood, I think Bronzeville in some ways, I think Washington Park now, you know. I mean, even, you know, I can remember having conversations with, you know, other Black folks about how, you know, when I was living in Washington Park, that, you know, the gentrification there had a Black face, and some folks were like, we're cool with that, right? And knowing what that meant for the masses of the other Black folks that was there, right? That they were going to be pushed out, but, you know, I guess they had hopes that maybe they would fit the mold and fit the bill to be able to stay, right? So yeah, I definitely think that gentrification is definitely multifaceted, right? It's not just this Black or white issue. And in some cases it is, right? In some cases it's not. I think that the way to fight it is I definitely agree that, you know, it's not a, you know, one individual not deciding to move here is not going to impact that. I think we have to, you know, focus on who the person who holds power in that situation is, right? And, you know, that's the realtors, right? That's the developers. You know, I think we've seen this happen before, right? We've seen this happen before when, you know, white folks were tricked out of, you know, selling their property for, you know, these high rates, and then, or really cheap, I'm sorry. And then Black folks were like kind of forced to buy them at these, you know, really high rates, right? We've seen this issue play itself out before. And, you know, Black folks and white folks at that time were pointing fingers at each other when, you know, a real estate developer or a real estate agent, he walked away with all this money in his pocket, right? Went on to the next house. So yeah, I think, you know, we have to really think about, you know, who really, you know, holds the power in these situations. I think, but what I do think on an individual basis that has to happen is, you know, if the school is being closed in your neighborhood, right, that mostly is going to impact Black students, I think you got to roll up your sleeves and get in that fight. I think that if there's an issue around, you know, affordable housing, right, or something like that, I think you have to, you know, roll up your sleeves and get in that fight and show solidarity. So even though, one individual may not, you know, shape gentrification not happen, that one individual can get in the fight to make sure the folks who are still living there, you know, stay in the fight a little bit longer. So, you know, and I think that is what is definitely owed, you know, because and also I think, you know, everybody wants their neighborhood to look better, right? So like when they add these different commodities to a neighborhood, like I always say, Black folks want to enjoy that stuff too, right? The folks who were in that neighborhood first, you know, everybody wants their neighborhood to be upgraded. The issue comes is when the folks who are living there before don't get to reap the benefits of that neighborhood being upgraded. And so I think those who are moving in, even though individually, like their decision to not move in may not have an impact, they, I think, do have a duty to get in the fight to make sure the folks who are still there are treated with respect and get to stay if they want.
So yeah, I know Dixon's next, and I know, but after him, there's a comment I actually have had this conversation with people in a book club that I'm in. We're reading Hood Feminism, so I did want to throw in a comment, but after Dixon, of course.
No, you could throw your comment in. Well, she can. I go after you.
I was actually going to say, when you said about Black people liking to enjoy these things, but Black people also participating in gentrification, I was actually speaking to a few women. They were like, yeah, you know, I have money. I want to be able to buy this house and do these things. And yes, you know, the thing with them and me, right, because of our kind of differing ideologies, they want to be able to enjoy those things and they want to be able to have those things, but they're more okay with it being at the expense of poorer Black people. And that's where the problem lies. Like, we can have nice things. Poor people have buying power, right? So we should be able to go to these nice places and have these nice places, right? But again, think about it. One, this place wasn't built for you. It wasn't built for well-off. It wasn't built for any Black people, well-off or otherwise, right? That's one thing. Thinking about like, oh, a sushi restaurant. If a sushi restaurant popped up in North Lawndale, my rent's going up. I know it. I just know it, right? Because they're not thinking about me or these other, you know, kind of these other residents. They're thinking about who's coming next, who will add this value. And even though we have buying power, they're not seeing the value of that buying power over someone else. So to me, our kind of the crux of our arguments were, I like nice things, and I think the city and the state should invest in making sure my neighborhood is nice and good and clean. But the only way they're going to do that is, one, through extra policing, right? And two, gentrification. And that is, I think, where the problem lies. And so we had this conversation about gentrification, and for them, it's like, well, it's bad if it's not us doing it to each other. So I thought that was great that you brought that issue up.
Yeah, and I'll just, I'm going to jump in real quick, because I think what we're getting at is and I know this is like a college, you know, course. So like, I'm going to just throw some names out there. We could really get into, I think, what you're addressing and talking about, right? When we talk about I think so. There are immediate solutions, and then there are like, what's the long-term vision, and like how do you add your current tactics that affect immediate stuff to long-term stuff, right? So for me, rent control is something that's necessary in the state as an organizer and also as, you know, a policy person. But rent control, all rent control does is let me like subdue or modify capitalism, right? Capitalism in and of itself is anti-Black through its origins and through the way it functions, right? Like currently, if every Black person owned the building that they lived in, that doesn't address the historic inequities that are there, and that doesn't affect the ways in which capitalism works. That's why when we talk about white supremacy, it's not just racism, it's also the capitalism piece, right? If all the Black people in the world suddenly had the majority of wealth, because we're in a a white supremacist society, there would be new laws created. There would be excessive fees or fines or ways to take that wealth from Black people like it's being taken from us now, right? So long term, our liberation, right, has to be rooted in anti-white supremacy, being an anti-racist, right, but also being anti-capitalist. Right? I just want to throw that out there. On the piece about black faces in high places hurting or doing things that don't make poor Black people have an opportunity to live well, right? Like there are tons of folks you can talk about. Joy James, you can talk about Robert Allen, who talk about the function that middle class Black people can have in upholding white supremacy. In that I become a race manager, right? I'm doing well, therefore I can represent the community at tables without going through a democratic process, without actually representing folks, without actually taking survey, and do things that one help me maintain wealth, but also maintain white supremacy, right? So I think that's really, really important just to think about. I think the conversation is moving more to that theoretical frame, right? So it isn't good, and it is essential that Black folks own businesses and that Black folks own homes and that we have Black landlords and things like that. But ultimately, we cannot let those positions or those things detract from pushing forward things that ultimately eradicate poverty, right? I don't want to be a successful person in a system that allows millions of people to starve every year, that allows hundreds of thousands of people in the state of Illinois to be homeless, that allows thousands of people to freeze to death every winter, right? So even if I become a millionaire, even if I become a billionaire, I'm more successful, air quotes, on paper than a lot of friends I went to school with or live with or currently hang out with or know, right? But that does not mean that I, right, then have a right to speak for those people. It also doesn't mean that my advancement should come at their detriment, right? So I think that's just an essential thing to think about. So we have to like understand our micro choices, but also look at them in a macro context, right? So if like, yes, it is. Is there a term for Black folks that deal with the similar? Yeah, I mean, I think the model minority myth that deals with Asian people is another function of like the race manager, right? But it's just broader, right? So when you become the model minority, not only do you get to put Black people down or other Asian folks down to appeal to white supremacy to advance yourself, right? It's just another rung up on this like messed up ladder. So that's all.
I know there's also referred to it as like the talented 10th, that idea that it's like 10% of these group or these people, or it's generally referred to by, for Black people, that they are the exemplar and everyone else isn't trying hard enough. But we have run out of presenter time and Q&A. I'm really glad we were able to weave this in and out, weave the questions in and out. It was a really different style, and I think people really appreciated it. We do have more questions. I can kind of, we see if y'all, we can send them to y'all, or people can try and answer each other. Yes, so that is our time for our discussion section, or this presentation portion.
So thank you so much, Dr. Zimmer, John, and Dixon. We really appreciate your time. So at this point, we will pause the recording, and the rest of our class portion is for registered students. So if you're not registered, we thank you for tuning in. We have a couple of, again, more great lectures coming up. So as you registered for this session, feel free to check out the Epidemics of Injustice webpage and register for future sessions. So thanks for joining us. And students, we will come back at 7:05 to start with our discussion. Faces. Okay, thank you. Hi everyone, as always, we're recording this section and it will be posted to Blackboard as opposed to the full recording for the world. So we have, it looks like we still have Dr. Zimmer with us. And let's see, Dixon is still on as well. So feel free to chime into our discussion. And if any of you have questions, feel free to, again, keep dropping those in the chat. John is here as well. So thank you all for hanging on with us. You're our first guest speakers to hang out with us after the main session. So it's nice to see you. And hopefully you'll see more faces of our real life students. So this week we had our 3 readings and I pulled some of the questions raised from the discussion board. But before we get to those, do folks have any kind of reactions or thoughts they like to share?
I thought a lot about the new plaza in Englewood, the one that on 63rd Street that has the Whole Foods and the Starbucks and the Chipotle. So I'm familiar with that plaza because when we were still meeting in person, I had a school program at Team Englewood High School up until it closed. And we were running that program right when that plaza was being built. And then we also made the time to just like walk around and check out the plaza. And one thing that we noticed that the Whole Foods, and we had conversations with employees at the Whole Foods that were telling us that like the prices were adjusted. The Starbucks, for example, has all these signs everywhere, how like some of the stuff is locally sourced. But after today's readings, I'm not left very convinced that even though they're utilizing local resources, hiring people from the neighborhood, it still feels like a lot of the businesses in that plaza are inaccessible to the majority of the community. So just wanted to share that thought I had.
A little secret that's not actually a secret. There are quite a number of stores, especially chains, that will have higher prices in low-income neighborhoods. In my documentary I did that I keep mentioning, but I've never showed any of you, right? One of the participants was like, I go to, I live in this neighborhood and I go to, it's a Kroger. I don't know if there's Kroger in Chicago, but Kroger, right? I go to Kroger and the prices in the Kroger in the suburbs when I can take the bus, because their buses used to break down a lot in Jackson, when I can take the bus are actually lower than the Kroger prices in the city, where I am in a lower income neighborhood. Oh, Jewel-Osco is like the equivalent. Yeah. So yeah, supermarket redlining. Yeah. So that is something, if anyone has ever seen Girlfriends, there's one episode where they talk about the soda company and they have proof that, they have marketed, oh, thank you, Mrs. Grant. They will market, and they'll market it at a higher price than in other more affluent neighborhoods. So I thought that was also something to think about too, as well. Yeah. Oh, Zoe, this question's amazing. Dr. David Stovall actually knows of literature that addresses the correlation between, for instance, UIC and universities and gentrification. So I can just put his name in the chat. So you can, and he actually does work in North Lawndale, Little Village, and Pilsen. So yeah, he was recently a keynote at our symposium that we had. So he actually has, and there's works that have been produced by university professors, but the university does not promote, for obvious reasons, about the ways in which UIC, UChicago is obviously in Hyde Park, so there's probably work by people from Hyde Park about that. But yeah, so he actually has access to that information.
So I will go ahead and throw out my slide for some some things that folks raised on the discussion board this week. And Dr. Zimmer, as you see, has 2 questions that specifically mention you. So maybe we can hear from you a little bit. So one of the questions was how can genuine solidarity be incorporated into program planning and ensuring the workforce is competent when addressing health disparities? So I think we've kind of talked about like anti-racism, basically every class session so far, rejecting racism and working to defeat it. So what any students or Dr. Zimmer or other folks, what does it look like to you to incorporate these ideas into program planning and thinking more at like organizational system levels efforts?
Supposed to answer. I'm confused now.
Would any of our guest speakers like to take a stab at this first question?
I encourage other folks to step forward. I'm sure you probably have better ideas about program planning and health disparities and so forth, the ins and outs. I don't know that I have anything particularly insightful to say, except for that I do think that white people should reject racism, and solidarity is a reasonable goal. But as far as the specifics, I'd love to hear what you guys think.
I actually do wonder about this in terms of where neighborhoods are built, in terms of like, Chicago's very industrial. So the placing of poorer, or the kind of design of poorer neighborhoods. I was thinking about this with the Hillco incident, because, I live on your little village. And so, and now in I think it's either South Shore or South Side, they're building this plant that people in the North were like, no, we don't want this here, but then they're going to build it, in the southern part where there are a lot of Black people. Southeast side. So for me, I guess I kind of think about how, when we're addressing these health disparities, especially when it comes to housing or housing planning, we should also be looking at the ground. Like, we're looking at the neighborhoods they're built in. Are you building this on some like formerly industrial ground where the soil and the air quality is not good, right? And that's why you're putting people here. That's why you're encouraging people to move here. Or are you building, or are you, again, and then you're like, when we were talking about how South Shore has a lot of cheap lakefront property now, are you going to push those people out and push them into an environment that is, again, more industrial, heavy traffic, heavy metals? And I think that that's a really important part of the discussion, right? When we're talking about how do we incorporate these things, and we're talking about health disparities, and we're going to these meetings, we can say, well, you're building these things, or you have these other structures in place, and they're not healthy. They're actually causing our neighborhoods collectively to be less healthy, whether it's a pandemic or not. And kind of, I think that's how those two for me marry. Because where I live in public housing back home is next to a train yard, like a train repair yard. So there's a lot of heavy metals, a lot of construction, a lot of stuff going on in the air. The workers have masks, but we live right there and we have nothing.
Can I chime in on this a little bit? So yeah, we actually talked about that in one of my, interdisciplinary courses, or it's 401, so social determinants. And we've talked about, we actually had a speaker that came in, I think she was part of like the urban planning, or it was metropolitan something for the city of Chicago. And she showed us a map of the areas, like the industrial areas that could only be used for industrial purposes. And they were predominantly in the South and over East neighborhoods. And I think that's one of the reasons why they want to close that plant up in Lincoln Park, because I guess they were saying the way it looked and then and all of those things. It wasn't aesthetic to the Lincoln Park image. But the other pieces of the puzzle was that a lot of like the homeless people had used the scraps from that thing to actually, you know, feed themselves and turn it in and get money for it and things. So then now those people are going to be losing income to try to help sustain daily, because they didn't want that type of population in the aesthetic part. But when we saw the map of the landscape of Chicago, of how it's only certain areas you can only make as industrial places, and they're predominantly over on the east side of Chicago, and they can only be used for that because the same land has always been that type of infrastructure. So you're talking about generations of metals and all those things. So they keep us in the neighborhoods. And we also talked about the Pimcoke piles over there by like Lake Calumet and things. So all of those things they predominantly put in these neighborhoods. And I think the way they're going to try to promote it, they haven't done it yet, is that, it's going to bring new jobs to the area. So that's what they're going to do. I'm pretty sure that's what they're going to do when they start to do that. But yeah, it's like they only can use these certain spots of land for these types of purposes. And it's sad because it's like, they can just close the plant down and just leave it shut down, or just leave it where it is. But it's like, oh no, we're just going to put it back over there where all the other crap is, because they still haven't cleaned up the stuff from like previous industrial things there, like the steel mill kind of got moved to Indiana and all those things. But that's kind of still where over the east side, because that's kind of where that border is to Indiana. So it's so interesting how they don't the air quality. I have a lot of friends that is in EOHS, and they just talk about that so much, and how the air quality and all of these plants. I mean, at first it was good because it was a way to people of color to obtain wealth, because they were able to buy homes near these plants too, because that's where they worked. But now that they are all closed down, they just have these spaces, and they can't even be used to be built for residential housing. They can only be industrial spaces. So I just want to chime in on that to give a little insight, because it's so interesting how at the beginning of my program, they were just talking about how they didn't like the aesthetics of it. And now I'm almost done with my program, and now they're talking about closing it down and moving it over into the southeast side. And that's over within a year. So that's so interesting that the city moves fast on the things when it's to continuously disproportion or marginalized communities. But when we need the help, it takes forever and a day.
Yeah, exactly. So this kind of ties back to kind of our earlier lectures in the semester, when we were talking more about power and organizing more generally, and thinking about whose interest is it to make this change, right? And even today we were talking about what's in the interest of the residents versus the landlords versus the city and whoever else is making the money off of the way things are. And so when we talk about program planning, I think and I think some of our students are in positions of power wherever they are. I think when we're talking about program planning and competency in the workforce, and this can be like within organization, within government, even within like academia, or in hospitals where some of you all work. There's different levels of it, and tying back to our conversations about using power that we have as individuals as well as collective power, and mobilizing for collective power. And as someone who has power, a really important way to incorporate anti-racism in your work is to create those spaces for the marginalized people, the people who are actually impacted by policies and decisions, spaces for them to actually come to, be heard, and then also respecting what is said and actually choosing to act on them, right? So yeah, I'm sure all of us have seen kind of the solidarity emails from companies after last summer saying they're in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, but that doesn't mean that they're anti-racist, right? So But when we're talking about incorporating these ideas, it requires actual action and structural change into like the way that things function. So a lot of, and I think we'll talk about this in the week we talk about environmental justice. There's a lot of policies that people try to put in place to require notice from companies who want to, I don't know, an example of like someone wants to build a gas station, or someone wants to build a factory, or someone wants to build a pipeline, or whatever it is that affects the environment and the people around it. So there's requirements for those people to notify the community, and depending where it is, these requirements are all different. But notifying the community, having a public forum, having this many days notice for that forum. So having spaces like that are really important to having anti-racist approaches actually integrated into the implementation. So hopefully that helps with whoever had this question. Yeah, so another one on here is, can anyone think of examples of something maybe outside of Chicago in which gentrification doesn't result in unjust situations? I could not think of any. I wanted to get folks' thoughts.
I think it's interesting because I think, so again, I'm going to refer to my disability studies background as I often do. We actually had a conversation about this, about institutions. Are there any good institutions? But the issue is by definition of an institution, that there's this kind of hierarchy and that you don't have as much agency as you would have outside of it. So the very nature of institutions, itself, and I think it's the same with gentrification, the very nature of gentrification, right? There are other phrases for neighborhoods that, are on the up and up or on coming up or things like that, that aren't gentrification, right? But the very nature of gentrification is harm, right? Because the very nature of gentrification implies displacement. And whether it's through very quote unquote violent or non-violent means, right? I think that the very definition would. Now, I think that there are ways in which, for instance, if there's like a town that's dying, because there are some towns that are dying, they've like less than 10 people, they're ghost towns, and people go there, right? They go to this ghost town, they revitalize this economy. That's not gentrification, right? That's some kind of like renewal or restorative or some kind of thing like that. But gentrification, I think by its definition, is this kind of more violent, volatile displacement process.
Yeah, and if I could just add one small thing, I really agree with that, Washika. This is maybe just echoing something John said earlier, but there ought to be a distinction between development and gentrification. Like gentrification means displacing people, removing people from their communities. So sometimes people think that because this is in a way kind of true under capitalism, if there are no rent controls or anything else, it seems like the only way a neighborhood's infrastructure can improve is if there's wealthier people moving in and there's gentrification. So it almost looks like there's sometimes two possibilities: just utter neglect and like crumbling, infrastructure, or like gentrification, things improve but people get pushed out and they're not around to enjoy them. I'd like to see, there be improvements in development, but people aren't, but without displacement, without people getting pushed out. So I think maybe that distinction helps because, then there could be improvement to neighborhoods, but the residents actually are able to stick around and enjoy the improvements. They're not going to get pushed out.
Yeah, I really like what, so Sarah that posted this in the chat, she said, I think we should support the organizing against General Iron moving to the southeast side, but if we win that, then isn't General Iron just going to go to some other neighborhood? And I think that's a really great point, and the question of like the long-term struggle, right? So like they're not gonna go to the southeast side, but maybe they'll try the west side or some other site, or in another city. And that's how, I mean, yeah, I think John and Dixon like alluded to Gary, Indiana, but part of Gary's development is because they didn't want to think some of those things didn't want to build in Chicago, so they went to Gary. So yeah, I think it ties into like the larger movement, and the question makes me think of kind of our conversation with Ben Levinson and Justice Global, and talking about the broader scope of all these issues that we see here in Chicago aren't just Chicago issues. It's a pattern, and the way that like our society is built in all of its neoliberalism is that we have, in order to see these things change both locally and in a large scale, means to kind of like flip the script. So that was a great point that was raised. Okay, our time goes by so quickly and it's stressful to pick questions. I'll leave it for students. Does anyone have a question? Shreya said, should finding what counts as development versus displacement require the input of local Indigenous groups? Or is the input of the groups currently living in the community enough? I think it's a great question.
I wonder if it can be both. I mean, I have so many, I think as an African-American, I have many opinions and feelings about land and things like that. But I think that wouldn't it be both? Like Chicago has, I think it's like the third largest urban population of Indigenous people. Mm-hmm. So in these neighborhoods, right, there are Indigenous people. It's not like they're not living in the neighborhoods. And I do think that you can look to the Indigenous people in your neighborhood to also ask about that, right? So it wouldn't be like, oh, well, let's ask Indigenous people on XYZ reservation. We can ask the Indigenous people here, they exist. I also think we should, like I've said, homeless people in your neighborhood are your neighbors. I think that input's also important, and it's been very disvalued. And so I do think about that too. So I think that if we're looking at Indigenous people, there are Indigenous people in our neighborhoods we can look to and talk to and come on.
Yeah. I think in an ideal situation, all the feedback of the stakeholders, especially those that are marginalized, is the most important. Yes, and Sarah, the Dudley Street in Boston, still Black. They renamed Dudley Square Nubian Square like last year. So that's really awesome. You can look that up, the Holding Ground documentary. Okay, we're nearing our end. We do have a question for John, if you have a chance to chime in. Do you have an idea of when the low end became Bronzeville?
I do not. It's weird because I guess, the more you learn, I guess it was always Bronzeville, right? Technically. Yeah, I don't know. I know when I was younger, it was definitely the low end. I would say maybe in my early 20s, I was riding around and somebody said Bronzeville, and I said, that's interesting. Where is that? And he was like, we in it right now. I said, I don't think this isn't Bronzeville, right? So I would say when I started recognizing it was probably in maybe about 10 years ago. So, but.
I wonder if it's just one of those like colloquial things too. Like people in the neighborhood may say that, or people maybe, have different ideas. So I said, I live in the South Bronx, but technically, and they don't call it this that much anymore, but it's technically called Yankee Village. So the 5 blocks around Yankee Stadium or Yankee Village, and I live right within that. You can see the stadium from my house. Like I can see the stadium from my house. And so I was talking to my mother about it. And I was like, yeah, because we live in Melrose Project. She's like, well, no, technically we live in Yankee Village. And I was like, what? She's like, it's all these projects around here. This is Yankee Village. And I'm just like, Mom, what? What do you mean? She's like, yeah, the 5 blocks, because she's, in the Bronx her whole life. The 5 blocks around Yankee Stadium are called Yankee Village. People don't say that as much anymore, but people who've been living here for a while, that's one way you knew where in the South Bronx you were, because the South Bronx is literally like the south half of the Bronx, then there's the middle, then there's the north, and nobody goes from north. But that's how you further kind of designate your particular area.
One more point to that, then I'll be quiet, I promise. Also, I think we see like Bronzeville is starting to grow. Like I've heard like 50, 60, like areas that are like traditionally, historically Washington Park or other areas are starting to get lumped in with Bronzeville. So I think it definitely shows like this larger plan to kind of, like we've been saying, gentrify, right? And kind of rename things.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so maybe our last questions. Students, if you have to go, you are free to, but I love this discussion. What type of catalyst, good or bad, do you think is needed to mobilize people in ways that we haven't seen in a long time, like the Communist Party in the 30s for housing justice? And then what are or are going to be the biggest barriers to mass mobilization in organizing around housing? Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think we have the catalyst now. I'm not sure if any of the organizers want to chime in, but I think people are mobilizing more now than they were even last year or 2 years ago. I think especially now, like we talk about anti-racism a lot more openly, and the importance of that and the implications of it a lot more openly. And I think that is the first step, kind of one of our first questions in talking about incorporating anti-racism into our practices. Like the first step is understanding what anti-racism is and the possibilities and what it means to be anti-racist. So I think that with that increasing awareness and folks being more increasingly committed to it, I think that's really the first step in getting people to mobilize in ways that we haven't really seen more recently. So I'll let other folks chime in.
I also think it's people are more open about their ideological affiliations now too. And I think that, even though we're definitely past that kind of Red Scare kind of blacklist moment, that still does happen, right? But I think that because people can be more open about, I do this because this is what I feel, this is what I believe, this is a core belief. And yeah, there's this politics behind it. And there are a lot of people who are religiously driven to do these things. I know a lot of people who are leftists because they're like, this is, if I'm reading a religious text, it's what it says. It's the same thing, right? You feed people, you house them, you take care of them, you love them as if they are your own. Everybody is your neighbor and all these things. And I have a friend who works at it's like a Christian home thing where they help homeless people transition, and she's like, yeah, we all believe that as our core principles, and we think that in the Bible that there's justification for these things. Other people who are other religions, I have friends who are all different kinds of religions, they feel the same way. And so I think that because people are much more open about that now, we can say, this is what we're organizing around, an ideology, but also our faith leads us. And also, we can find, and with the internet, it's so much easier to find people who have those similar ideas. And sometimes we all kind of leftists all argue with one another, right? But for the most part, we do have these ideas of we need to help each other. We need to help lift each other. And even though sometimes organizing with each other is hard, it's, we are who we have. We are who we've been waiting for to create a better world. And I like that. I like that we've moved more openly and we're less theoretical and more praxis-based. Because all that theory, just like, what was it, Fred Hampton said, theory ain't nothing without practice. What is it going to do to just sit around and talk about it? I like that. And I like that a lot of people here, a lot of students are actively in these areas to work to make improvements. This isn't just a class you pick up and put down and you leave on the shelf. You're all taking something from this and you're all contributing something to this. We're building something together.
Does anyone want to have the last word on our discussion? All right. Just one kind of housekeeping thing for class. We do have a kind of prep assignment for the session next week. So I'll just throw up this slide. Thank you, Dr. Zimmer. Thank you, John and Dixon. It was great to have you and all of your knowledge. So just a little housekeeping thing. So for class next week, we're going to be put into breakout groups based on these 5 different areas of interest. So just think about what group you want to be in. We'd like them to be relatively even. And if no one likes a particular topic, we can switch it out. And so we have discussion, we have groups up on Blackboard, so you can choose what group you want to be in. And then before class next Thursday, you all just need to communicate with each other to decide what policy change you want related to that topic. So please do that, and I'll send out a note tomorrow morning, so you'll all get emailed with the directions. The directions are also posted on Blackboard. So feel free to, email me if you have questions about that. Otherwise, I will see you all next week, I guess.
Just a quick question. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Do we sign up for the groups on Blackboard? Is there like a comment and say me or?
Yeah, so I will, maybe I can share my screen. Oh gosh. So I added a link on the Blackboard site. So you should see a thing that says policy group sign up. Sorry, I'm pulling it up right now.
Yeah, I see it. It's really quite clear. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, it says policy group sign up. I was like, make it very visible because, policy and action groups, and then you could pick which group you want to join. So self-select. So again, we want them to be like relatively even, but if like everyone's interested in 4 groups and not interested in another one, we can break things up. Or if a group of folks are interested in one area, that is fine. Just email me, let me know, and I can update all the things that need to be updated.
Can I ask a quick question? For
Sure.
the medical education one, is that just med school, or could we broaden it to like medical/health education, so like a pipeline?
I think it could be brought in.
Okay, thank you.
I guess, if there are folks interested in that. These categories are created on like questions and what it seems like you guys are interested in. So, that's my interpretation of different areas people are interested in. Yes, okay. So if anyone has other questions, feel free to reach out. I will send a note out from Blackboard tomorrow morning, kind of going through all the directions for this. So I will look forward to seeing you guys next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.